Bonjour tout le monde, Salon. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next Sleep Salon for November as part of our research creation project, the Sociability of Sleep. My name is Alanna Thain, and along with Alex Kaminska, who's also here today, I'm co-director of the Sociability of Sleep. And welcome back to people who've joined us before, and hello to anybody who is new. As you can see, we're recording this session, and please feel free to leave your camera off. And when we post it on the website, it will also be captioned as well. And you can see all of the previous recordings of our sleep salons up on our website, sociabilityofsleep.ca. I'm going to begin first with a land acknowledgement that the Sociability of Sleep is physically located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. We recognize with gratitude that they are the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet, live, and rest. And Tiohtià:ke has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe peoples. And I'll also share an acknowledgement from the feminist media studio Concordia for Pandemic Assembly that while Zoom, a company that has exploded in value during the pandemic, is the technical custodian of the platform on which we gather, this makes us no less occupants of the multiple territories on which we are all physically located. I think someone just needs to turn their sound off. Zoom's headquarters are located on Mawekma Ohlone territory, and the Ohlone have historically understood about sustainability, communal society, and giving gifts to those who pass by and sharing space. Their horizontal organization might inspire different modes of peer-to-peer networking in the pandemic that is still continuing than those that we're enacting here in Zoom. And we see Zoom as a platform which connects us and which alienates us from the aims of restitution, justice, and reparation. I'd like to acknowledge as well that the Sociability of Sleep is supported by funding from the Government of Canada's New Frontiers in Research Fund. And on our website, sociabilityofsleep.ca, you can sign up for the newsletter to find out more about upcoming events such as future sleep salons, our upcoming exhibition, and more. And please reach out, of course, if you're interested in learning more or collaborating. So thanks again for being here today for the Politics of Sleep. During the chat, or during the salon rather, please feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts and comments if you have relevant links that our discussion today brings up for you. There'll be a Q&A after our speakers, who are each going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, but we'll save questions until both people have had a chance to speak. You can open your mic and ask questions. You can post them in a chat. We'll keep a kind of speakers list if you use the raise hand function. Today's conversation will take place in English, but please, of course, feel free to make comments or ask questions in French as well, and we are happy to translate. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our speakers that we're very, very pleased to have with us today. We thank them both for being here. CRESSIDA J Hayes is our first speaker. CRESSIDA is a professor of political science and philosophy and also holds a Henry Marshall Torrey Chair at the University of Alberta in Canada. They are the author of 3 monographs, most recently the really excellent Anaesthetics of Existence, Essays on Experience at the Edge, published in 2020 by Duke University Press, and winner of the David Easton Award from the American Political Science Association. And if you're interested in some of the questions that we'll be talking about here today, I encourage you to go back and take a look at that book as well. More about their work can be found at cressidahays.com, and we'll share that link in the chat as well. CRESSIDA is currently chair, our condolences, of the Department of Political Science, but when not doing administrative work, is working on a SSHRC-funded book tentatively titled Sleep is the New Sex, which will be the first feminist philosophy of sleep. And one piece of that project has just appeared in the journal Critical Inquiry called Reading Advice to Parents on Children's Sleep, the Political Psychology of a Self-Help Genre. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to CRESSIDA.
Thanks very much, Alanna, for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be speaking today at the Sociability of Sleep Salon. This is a project that I greatly admire and have been following since its inception. And I'm really delighted and feel honored that the people who organize it have invited me to be a part of it. I join you this early morning where I am from Miskochiwaskayagun in the Cree language, or the city of Edmonton, which is on Treaty 6 territory and is also the Métis homeland. I'm going to share my screen and hope that that shows you some images. I'm very aware that when I'm on Zoom and I'm sharing my screen, I can't tell if something goes wrong. So feel free to unmute and say, Cressida, your slides are stuck, or whatever has happened, because otherwise I can sort of lose track of what's going on in the Zoom room. Okay, so that's that. Okay. So everybody can see that first slide, right? Yes, good. Okay. So as Alanna said, I'm working on a book tentatively entitled Sleep is the New Sex. And the one-liner that I use to describe what it is, which she already stole, is that it's the first feminist philosophy of sleep. That sounds a little bit grandiose, perhaps. I've been working on this for a long time, really for nearly a decade, which is a bit shocking. And many parts are being written. It's sort of scattered over the shop floor of my intellectual life in pieces, and has yet to be really put together. And I think that that mode of working is in some ways consonant with the theme, with the material of the work. As Alanna said, I'm a philosopher. And so what I want to do today is to give you a deep dive into just one little piece of this project. But I'll tell you just in a couple of minutes off the top here, what's going on with these parts on the shop floor. One thing I've been working on is an article about sexual violence and sleep. So a few years ago in the journal Signs, I published an article called Dead to the World, Rape, Unconsciousness and Social Media, that was about sexual violence against people who are unconscious. And I've been following that up with some work on memoir of things that one can't remember. So to what extent is it possible to write memoir about things that happened, including while one was asleep? So that's one piece of this. I'm writing also a couple of things about parenting and family life and sleep. One of them, Alanna mentioned, has just come out in Critical Inquiry, which is about the subtext or the hidden language that's in advice to parents about children's sleep. I'm sure that there are some parents on the call who have had to work out ways of coping with the extreme sleep deprivation of particularly having a newborn. And so I'm interested in the advice genre as exemplary of a kind of domination that I argue represents sort of tensions in neoliberal understandings of citizenship. So it's about how to read all of these awful books like Ferber and Sears and all of the more contemporary instantiations of that advice as a kind of object relations political theorist. So that piece is there. And then I also have done some interviews. This is one of my first forays into interview-based research with my student, Janique Tucker, with sleep coaches and the parents who hire them. So we have an article that's under review where we talk about what it means to invite an expert into your family to give you advice about sleeping as a family, as a mother, and just thinking about the intrusion of expertise into intimate life and how that intersects with a very class-inflected discourse of intensive mothering. So that piece is another part of this parenting stuff. And then the piece that I'm going to, there's another article. You see, this is the scattered thing about working from bed. That's my pandemic writing. So trying to think about what it means to use your bedroom as a place of work. And of course, as many people on this call will be aware, the discourse about sleep, which is really growing, and I think that we can say that there's now something called sleep studies, is very intimately connected to questions about work and leisure and rest. And so, and the comments I'm going to make today come from a really long and rambling section of the book that's trying to think through how the history of discussion about the so-called work ethic, workism, and ideologies of work intersect with ways of thinking about sleep. So all of these pieces lie scattered around trying to find a home in a singular project called Sleep is the New Sex. For several years, I taught a seminar, a senior seminar called The Politics of Sleep. And so I'm also happy to talk about that in the Q&A if anybody is interested in the pedagogy or the kinds of topics that came up doing that work. So why this title, Sleep is the New Sex? Well, there's one fairly, I think, transparent and jocular kind of meaning for this, and then there's another that's a bit more philosophical. When I started this project, even a decade ago, there was already an enormous popular discourse about sleep, and that's only grown. It's really impossible to pick up any to enter any kind of media source without finding something about sleep. The archive of articles that I've collected is just enormous now, and I'm sure there are many people on this call who have their own archive of sleep-related stuff. And so sleep is everywhere in a way that we might think sex has always been, once was until recently. I suggest in the book that sleep in some sense has replaced sex as an object of popular analysis, of media scrutiny, and of cultural preoccupation, anxiety, even obsession. As with sex, everyone is worried about other people. Sleep is private and intimate, not really the sociability of sleep. I mean, the title says it, but it's treated in that way in many contexts. And so there's a great deal of speculation about how much sleep other people are getting. Is it better than mine? You know, are we all, who's getting what, and is it good enough? And so that's the kind of superficial allusion in the title of the work. But there's a second point that I want to make with the title, which is that if we remember what Michel Foucault says in volume 1 of The History of Sexuality, famously in the introduction to that book, he talks about what he calls the incitement to discourse about sexuality. So I'm sure lots of you know that text well, but a quick reminder, his specific example in that introductory section is Victorian sexuality. His sources are mainly English and French. And the idea that he represents to us is that in the 19th century, sex was repressed, barely spoken of, and that this mythology of what Victorian sexuality was continues into the present. He's writing in the 1970s as a story about how some global North cultures, at any rate, construct sexual discourse. So his question, as he famously says in that early part of the book, is not why are we repressed? This is the question that we're invited to ask. Why are we so repressed about sex? But, and here's a quote, rather, why do we say with so much passion and so much resentment against our most recent past, against our present, and against ourselves that we are repressed? By what spiral did we come to affirm that sex is negated? What led us to show ostentatiously that sex is something we hide, to say it is something we silence? So I'm asking an analogous question really about sleep. Why do we speak of sleep constantly in terms of a problem? Why do we affirm so vehemently that sex is negated? And so if we think about the incitement to discourse about sleep as opposed to about sexuality, I suggest we can look at some of the popular discourse in a new light. So how we talk about sleep is symptomatic. So I want to return to a little spat, a little debacle that happened in 2018 that I decided to return to for this these comments today, partly because this guy has been in the news so much in recent weeks, and for rather similar reasons. So Simon Williams says in his 2011 book, The Politics of Sleep, that there are three discourses of sleep: sleep negative, sleep positive, and critical. And sleep negative discourse, very familiar, I'm sure, to lots of people here, is a discourse in, and Williams doesn't mean the word discourse really in a Foucauldian sense, but I'm taking it up in that way, as containing as its central idea that sleep is devalued and dismissed as a hindrance to labor and productivity, particularly, as well as an inferior existential state when it's contrasted with conscious, rational, waking life. So my suggestion, not a novel one either, is that sleep negative discourse also creates a sleep negative subject. And this subject is often represented, typically archetypally represented, as an overworking elite masculine entrepreneur. So Alan Derrickson, I think, makes this argument very convincingly in his book Dangerously Sleepy, where he talks about the history of masculinity and labor relations. So he, as many people who talk about sleep do, talks about Thomas Edison as the American role model, who represented himself as disdaining sleep and claiming to survive through napping. So Edison famously is the inventor of the electric light, which fundamentally changed the relation between day and night, light and dark, and work and rest. As an aside, if you read Edison's own commentary, I just recently read, there's a little book called The Sundry Observations of Thomas Alva Edison. If you read what he writes in his diary entries and other ephemera about his own sleep habits, it really doesn't seem as if he is somebody who's working 120-hour weeks and hardly ever sleeping. It seems as if he actually sleeps quite a lot, worries about his sleep quite a lot as well, and has what today we might call a sleep disorder, probably a self-induced one. And so the gap even between what he says about himself in his private writings and how he incites his own representation in the media of the time is quite wide, right? Let alone between subsequent hagiographic interpretations of Edison's role. Here's Elon Musk pictured in 2018. You may recall in the summer of 2018, Tesla, his company, was in a crisis where he overtly referenced Edison. And I think Musk is somebody who has made a public career out of analogies between himself and Edison. He's very self-consciously representing his own sleep through this subjectivity of the sleep negative entrepreneur. He overtly referenced Edison, talking about the need to avoid sleep to maximize his working hours, and even showed journalists the hard couch in his office where he napped. So his claim was that he more or less lived in his office and took only short naps on this, which somebody has labeled for us not acceptable, couch. You may have seen those photos of Edison where he's lying very stiffly on his side in a three-piece suit on a sort of cot in a corner of his office in his own factory. So there's a very clear visual illusion here as well. I suggest that there's another aspect to this subjectivity that is much less often referenced, which is that it has a connection to neurodiversity and to ableism. And so the sleep negative subject is, we might say, manic. But this is not represented as a symptom of mental illness, even though mania is often associated with compulsive or destructive overwork, poor judgment, and hyperbolic claims about one's own prowess or about the world in general. Musk, as with other sleep negative subjects, evinces a lot of these symptoms, but because they're filtered through his elite masculine subjectivity, they get read as the product of genius. So I think that genius is another archetype that's at play here, that's enabling behaviors that might otherwise be seen rightly or wrongly in ableist language, often as symptomatic in a very literal sense of that word, are here read as marking him out as a subject of excellence. If you think about people who are slow, sleepy plodders, those people are often the ones who are represented as disabled. And conversely, people who are labeled disabled are often understood stereotypically to be slow rather than, for example, enduring. So I'm suggesting that there's an additional layer to this language here. If we contrast, as Williams does, the sleep negative discourse with sleep positive, there's, I think, another subjectivity that came into play in 2018 that is, I'm going to suggest, a reverse discourse rather than actually a different or contrapuntal way of thinking about sleep. The sleep positive entrepreneur is somebody who champions sleep as central to physical and mental health and defends its scientific, its medical management over its refusal, but typically also in the name of business success. So here we have Arianna Huffington, who in 2018, when Musk gave this confessional interview to the New York Times about his overwork, came in and wrote him a quote unquote open letter. So this is the embodiment in this text of the sleep positive subject. In that letter, and you may wish to come back to this image, which, you know, has all of these trappings of femininity in it. So the blush pink lingerie, the flowers, also references to technology or its absence, so the analog clock and the paper book and so on. So there's a lot to say about this picture, as well as about the way that Musk is visually represented. But in the text, in the open letter that Huffington writes to Musk, she accuses him of that particular form of bad faith, as such, I would say, that denies human facticity. So one way of being in bad faith is to fail to recognize the reality of human existence, and including its limits. So humans are not machines, she says. Downtime, sleep, is a feature. The science is clear. She encourages him, however, to make the most efficient use of his energy. So she has a model of the human subject that does, in fact, represent it as a kind of machine, right? Her own claims notwithstanding. Musk, she suggests, has extraordinary capacity and power. The best use of his energy, so we're all using energy. There's a kind of mutuality to the possibility for human beings to function like engines through the use of energy. But his energy, his capacity as an engine, is quite distinctive. Elon, she addresses him, the future of Tesla depends on you coming up with your masterpiece. So here's the genius discourse. It doesn't depend on how many hours you're awake. Tesla and the world, not to mention you and your beautiful children, so an allusion to family life, would be better off if you regularly built in time to refuel, recharge, and reconnect with your exceptional reserves of energy and your power to innovate. Working 120-hour weeks doesn't leverage your unique qualities, it wastes them. So, in her connection to the discursive genius, I suggest that she's constructing a sleep-positive entrepreneurial subject who maximizes their human capital, but in a way that uses all of the foundational conceptual blocks of the sleep-negative subject. So this isn't a genuine gesture of resistance to sleep negativity, it's a reverse discourse in Foucault's language. She's reinforcing the specialness of the manic energy producer, and she's using femininity to do so. But this, I suggest, I think not that controversially, is not a feminist gesture. When I gave a version of this paper at the American Political Science Association, the commentator was the political theorist Bonnie Honig, and Bonnie suggested to me that the iconography of the light bulb representing a new idea. So here's a particularly marked example of a light bulb moment directly connected to a machinic brain, is not ideologically neutral. So this icon equates energy and light with creativity and originality, and also implies that the progress of thought happens through sudden ruptures or breakthroughs, through eureka or aha moments, emerging from these busy working genius brains. Ideas then require wakefulness. In fact, I would argue knowledge development, as I'm sure this audience knows, is almost always a slow and collaborative process that involves long periods of gestation. I use that word advisedly. Seeming passivity, I use that word advisedly, or research dead ends. So we seem to have lost the association of sleep with creativity and breakthrough, which has been, in other contexts, a very recognizable cultural lexicon. So what if this icon, the one on the left is the one that Bonnie suggested, signaled a breakthrough? The icon on the right is the icon that I use for Sleep is the New Sex on Facebook and Twitter. So what if we returned to reverie, daydreaming, hypnagogia and hypnopompia, sleeping on it as sources of epistemic emergence? What if lying flat, Tangping, this Chinese movement of resistance to the culture of work, was not just a resistance movement, but a way of cultivating creativity through non-waking states? And I'm sure that there are lots of connections with Saodat's work here. So here's the more deeply feminist gesture, I suggest, the horizontal gestation of thought, rather than the manic generation of enough power to ignite the idea light bulb. So I'll just conclude with one more thought. What if there's an even more radical feminist gesture, radical political gesture? What if we don't need to have any projects at all? What about the experience of time that's utterly uninvested in generativity beyond its own experience? Sleep might be one way of one existential state that provides us with a way of thinking about that. In my book, Anaesthetics of Existence, which is in some ways a book that's on a kind of parallel track to the sleep project, and I talk a bit about sleep there. I coin a phrase, anesthetic time, and I talk about the experience of anesthetic time as possibly exemplary of this kind of projectless, drifting time that isn't marked by the needs to be productive or even generative. So I will just leave you with that, that idea and that possibility as maybe one place that we could talk and connect our ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, CRESSIDA. I'll just say that where you ended is exactly where we're going with our event at the Fondation Phi, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but it's very interesting to think about framing that as a feminist gesture, and I would love to talk about that more in the discussion. For now, I'm going to turn to our next speaker. Saodat Ismailova is an Uzbek filmmaker and an artist who graduated from the Tashkent State Art Institute in Uzbekistan and Le Fresnoy, the National Studio of Contemporary Arts in France. Her films and video installations represented the Biennale of Venice twice, I believe, the Berlinale IFF, the Rotterdam International Film Festival, CPH Docs, etc. Her works are in collections of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam and also the Centre Pompidou in Paris. In 2022, Saodat Ismailova participated in the 59th Biennale of Venice's main exhibition, The Milk of Dreams, which has many, many intimate connections to our project at Sociability of Sleep. And the work there is really extraordinary if you have a chance to see it before that closes. And presented new work, and as well as with part of the Davra research group at Documenta 15 as a Lumpur artist. Ismailova received the iArt and Film Prize in 2022, and her work focuses on ancestral knowledge, transgenerational transmission, myths, and female cosmogonies of Central Asia. So thanks so much for being with us, Saodat, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I'm very happy and honored to be part of this project Sleep Salon, which I find very inspiring and very interesting for me because I work a lot with sleeping bodies, which started somehow very intuitively, you know. Suddenly these sleeping bodies started appearing one after the other in my works, and with time I have understood that in fact what I'm doing is that I'm using the sleeping condition as a gateway to local knowledge, or the knowledge that is transmitted not as an information that is not verbalized, but it has another way of transmission, and a deep importance for a region such as Central Asia. Just to give you a little bit of a background for people, I'm sure that everybody knows where Central Asia is, but still it's important to know that we have been part of the Soviet Union that collapsed in 1992 during 70 years, but before that we have been colonized by Tsarist Russian Empire. So we know ourselves from the writings that have been mostly elaborated and created by anthropologists and historians in Russian expedition. So this is an access to when we want to know more about ourselves, where we address to. And through changing our alphabetization from Arabic to Latin, Cyrillic, back and forth several times, I think they did it 6 times during the last century. So we got cut off from the books that existed in the region before the arrival of the Russians. So somehow we were cut from, let's say, intellectual knowledge. And so the sleeping and dreaming for me became this gateway to access the knowledge that is unwritten, that is probably kind of we are distancing from it. But I was lucky that this attentive experience of sleeping was pointed to by my grandmother, you know, because every morning she would say, "What did you dream about?" You know, so that's the first question you have when you wake up. So I think it's an amazing exercise, because with time I understood that, which was strange for me to discover, that people don't memorize their dreams the way I memorize. But it's not that we don't dream. I believe we all dream, but I guess it's a training in our brain, as you need to tell every morning what you dreamt. You just develop a special attention from your childhood to your dreams, and you develop a capacity to memorize them. But also, what is very interesting is how you develop your relationship to your dreams. How you read them, or how you bound your emotional state to your dreams, and how you define the dreams that are just an impact of what you have lived the day before, or you were stressed, you were sad, and how that gets visualized. Or then there are the dreams that you know with time, and you can identify as dreams that come from another, I don't know how to say, another nature, or another fabric, or another space, you know. And this is also comes from a certain type of communication. To me, it came with my grandmother, where she would say, okay, this is, she would define where the dreams, which dreams that I should pay attention, or the others that are not important. And also, it's interesting to say that also I have discovered with time, but this is more through the scholars and through writings, that Central Asia, we are Muslim, but apparently in a Muslim world, it's Central Asia is specific, that we have our ancestral connection that happens through the dreams, which you cannot find apparently in other Islamic world, I guess, because we are more in East Asia, you know, and East Asia, even if it is the Islam was not spread there, it has another forms of a religious practice, but it has this ancestral connection through the dreams. So my first work related to a body of sleeping was Zuhra, and I believe it's probably the most radical one, because I have filmed a girl on a death deathbed of my grandmother sleeping, you know, and I just put her sleep, you know, throughout the day. I know it was challenging for her, but that was the only thing I asked her, please just spend your time on the bed, you know. And even though you can pretend to be sleeping, camera catches the moment when the body is sleeping and when it is not sleeping, because, you know, it gets more heavy. The weight of the body changes when it's really sleeping. And it's a work... Did I cut off or you hear me? Hello? Hello?
You're good. We can hear you.
You hear me, no? Because it froze for me. Everybody
okay.
froze? It's okay, but you can hear me still, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a work of a girl sleeping during 30 minutes. And the work is called Zuhra, which in English can be translated as Venus, the planet. That's how it is called in Central Asia, but I believe also in the Persian Iranian world, Zuhra, the Venus. And we have this legend about the girl that falls asleep and becomes a star, a planet. And this planet still serves today as a ritual for the women to wake up early in the morning to ask for the wish. But what I have used for me, it was interesting. It's a first work also where I have touched the sonic landscape as a narrative tool. And so when a mythic presence of a Zuhra or a Venus, the planet, can be used also how we excavate our memory. Let's call it like that. No, it's again a work with the memory and how the memory is signaled through our dreams and the images that appear in our dreams. And this work, Zuhra, became somehow autobiographical work because I was 30 years old when I did it, and there is 30 audio tracks of a narration that comes, and it is related to the history of Uzbekistan, about the creation of this country that also unfolds question of the delimitization, like the drawing of the borders of the Central Asia, creation of the nations, and also a big question of which is the question of the female emancipation, which was a big political mission of the Soviets especially in Uzbekistan. So somehow, for me, it was sleeping and excavating or exercising the memories through my body, but of the land that I come from and that I belong to. Well, I think I'm gonna just share with you a moment from my film that probably will speak for itself. Let me just 1 second. I'm sorry. This. If you don't hear or you don't see, please let me know.
I'm not sure what other people's experiences are, but I can't hear Saodat.
Don't hear it, right? Oh, you hear something?
Shunchalik bir havodan qayta Shunchalik shunchalik bir havodan qancha to'g'rilishini yo'q turib masalan men bormayman men shu yerga shahid bo'laman aytdim esimdan chiqib har kim shunchalik chiqsam shunchalik bir havodan 5 yil hamisha tasavvur qilib hammaga unday o'zgarib vaqtiga tez 5 yil 6 yil uydan uzoqqa chiqmay qanday bunday bo'ladi vaqtini o'zimga ayon endi aytdim-ku bugun bo'lganda erta shuni o'zimga ayon qilgan paytda
It might be a little bit challenging to share these videos online this way because unfortunately you cannot hear all the sound of the work because it's all built on the work, and that this is like the most active part of the work because most of the time you just see a girl sleeping. But what I also have noticed and I really loved is that when the audience comes and looks at my work, most of the time they slow down. And this is also something very important today. And what you have, CRESSIDA said earlier, that the knowledge is transmitted, it's in another time clock related to our body and mind, So, and I think that this is something very important today, to think about, to slow down, to how we process what we see, what we sense, but also use our sensorial capacity, because I think when there is this enormous flow of information, our sensorial capacity it just doesn't work, it gets blocked because our intellectual and mental processes overtake. So I also prepared the PDF that I start talking and forgot to share. 1 second, Sleeping Salon. Before I start speaking about my next work, I would like to share about the PDF. Sorry. Share. Here we go. So you see the PDF? Yeah. So this was the Zuhra, but then this question of the sleep kept on haunting me. So we have this incredible tradition, which is we shared our dreams with our water in the morning, when we don't feel comfortable. Before sharing with humans, we share it with water. So I always wanted to make a work with that, but I didn't know how to approach, to make a work about dreaming. It's as saying I want to make film about breathing or about life. I think it's quite equivalent because it's such an enormous space. It can be anything. So until the moment I have seen this stain of Rorschach, this the stain of ink that was used for the analytics. When I said, well, it's very interesting, what are the dreams that fall as stains into the body of water in Central Asia? And I made the 3-channel video installation called Stains of Oxus, because water is also a very important question in Central Asia. We are landlocked. We don't have access to the sea. We depend on 2 big rivers of Amu Darya and Sir Darya, and as you may know, they both die in the Aral Sea that is gone. It became a desert today. So I have followed this river. In fact, I followed people who inhabit the river banks of Amu Darya River from the glaciers down to to the RLC, and I asked them to tell me the dreams that they have once shared with the water. And so it became a body of work that I will not share because I think I don't have much time. But what is interesting is that when I have written down the interviews, this is from the work, suddenly archetypes and images came out that I was not aware of. I actually was aware of, but I was never paying attention, like, but you don't know, this point. So like presence of certain animals, a presence of elderly people giving you objects in your dreams, so there was an incredible map or a vocabulary of these archetypes that came out from the dreams of people that they have once shared to water. And most important for me was a figure of a tiger, of a Turan tiger that has extinct in Central Asia in the mid of 19th century because of the mismanagement of land and the water sources, but also the animal was sacred in Central Asia, and the way people's mind uses these images to tell the story of the region, I found quite fascinating. But also what was very interesting for me is that when they speak about their dreams, how suddenly you displace yourself from the reality to the space of the dreams, and you in fact get lost and you don't know where the reality or illusion is, so it can be easily displaced or switched from one place to the other. So and also the presence of this tiger in the dreams, which appears as a guide, as a healer, as a father, as a shaman, and from what I understood, a figure that insists on a transmission of the knowledge. And I made another work related only to this tiger, which I found in the dreams of people who told me their stories. And this is a project that I'm working on now, which is kind of still very open. I made only one first travel. Again, it's related to dreams, and it's and sleeping. It's in this forest called Arslan Bab in the south of Kyrgyzstan. It's a forest of walnut trees, which is apparently the oldest and the biggest natural forest of walnuts in the world. And why I was attracted to this space, it was related to the fact that people don't sleep under the walnut trees. I thought that it's only people, but apparently animals don't sleep under the walnut trees neither, because of the gas it produces called juglon, and it produces it in a certain part of the day, and there should not be a breeze or movement of the air, and it affects actually our brain and the way we dream when we sleep. So I was for a very long period curious about this mysterious connection of walnut trees and dreaming, and I'm still curious about it. So this new project is related to sleeping and the effect of the plants on our, let's say, how we produce images and how these images are related to the archetypes and this tradition of telling and retelling the dreams in the morning from generation to generation, and how the images are produced. So this is a new project I'm working on related on sleeping. I still don't know how it will look like, whether it will be an experience of my audience sleeping and producing these images, or it's gonna have another shape. Well, it's again to say that sleeping for me, it's a way of finding, I guess, a knowledge that has been somehow cut for for certain historical reasons, but I think it's also happening globally for the information, a massive attack of information we are facing today. And so I see in the process of sleeping kind of a gateway to, let's say, healing, or keep staying anchored to our human nature, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this connection to this idea of what is knowledge, and what kind of epistemologies sleep affords in itself, but also what kind of epistemology sleep might point us towards and to value, is such an interesting aspect of your work that I would love to know more about, and how it relates with these different kind of scales of encounter, the intimacy of the encounter with the grandmother, and then collecting these public stories, and then these kind of larger histories of colonialism and on language as well. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that a little bit more. So we have about 30 minutes for questions now. And I see already there's many threads that link these two projects. I'm really excited about thinking through some of those connections. Would anyone like to kick off the conversation? Because I have a lot of questions. A lot of questions. Maybe I'll start. Maybe I'll start with you, CRESSIDA. And actually, I think this might also be a question for you, Saodat, as well. I'm very interested in thinking about the work of sleep. And I really appreciated this articulation of the sort of non-opposition between the sleep negative and the sleep positive entrepreneur, and thinking about how sleep might provide an alternative. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about how a feminist approach that you're articulating might differentiate itself from what I sometimes think of as a kind of romantic preservation, kind of like, sleep is the last nature preserve of being untainted by work. If you could talk a little bit about the different way that you're articulating that feminist care for the space of sleep as a space of an opposition to this idea of work.
Sure, that's a great question. There's lots, I think, to say about that. I think the first distinction, which I don't see drawn often enough, is that when we're talking about states of consciousness, it's not as if being awake and being asleep are the only options. And so that seems like the sort of, well, whether literally or just sort of in casual language, deconstructing that binary seems like an important first move. And that's why I sort of just at one point kind of rattled off that list of alternatives, right? Reverie, daydreaming, hypnagogia, hypnopompia, all sorts of ways of thinking about multiple states, that dreaming, non-dreaming sleep. So I think that's where I would start with that, because so much of this facile opposition that's not really any opposition at all between sleep positive and sleep negative subjectivity, I think, depends on there's sleep when nothing happens, and then there's waking life when you're totally with it and you have great ideas and you're on at full speed. And that's so obviously false that it sometimes amazes me how much it's managed to permeate popular discourse. So that's not a specifically feminist point, but I made it, I think, through the examples of these two figures talking to each other in public, partly to show that there's a gender politics at play there. And the more kind of interesting way of thinking about it maybe is well, to do what Derrickson does, like to go through this kind of history of masculinity, but maybe to look at some philosophy that hasn't really been connected with sleep very much, like Cavarero, or to think about gestational metaphors, or being reclined as a state that is generative or pleasurable. I mean, another term that's not used very much, right? We talk so much in terms of, well, the worst version of the discourse is all about productivity versus lack of productivity. And I suggested you can sort of move that to words like generative and creative, and their opposites, but then you can also move it again to what would it mean to think of the emergence of, to reference Saodat's work, the emergence of new forms of knowledge coming from nothingness, however that's conceptualized, or the absence of rather than the presence of. Those are very big philosophical questions that have multiple feminist origins, I think. And so I'm just picking through a few of them, but I think it's there's lots of levels here of critique, and the way that we sit on the surface is frustrating to me intellectually, but also politically. So I'm hoping you have more ideas than that, or this audience has more ideas too.
Thank you. I think that's so helpful. I was also struck by your kind of list of these in-between states. I always think of my partner is always working on, non-binary approaches to listening. And so then I just start thinking about these non-binary approach to sleep as well. And I actually absolutely think that that's a very feminist perspective.
Yes.
And I wanted to just follow up on the question of work, though, with Saodat, because I'm a media scholar. I work on film a lot, and I'm very interested in listening to stories of how filmmakers work with and film sleeping bodies. And you mentioned the fact that you didn't ask your subject in your film Venus you were like, it's the only thing that I asked of her, but you also said it was very hard for her. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what it's like to film the labor of sleep in a certain way.
Well, I think that it is related to trust. It's a question of trust, to be able to sleep in front of another person, especially in this case, when you are aware that you are being filmed. Of course, there is this conscious of how your body looks like, so definitely it's a question of trust. And that this is one of the tools that I use when I work with people. I try to disappear in space, that they don't sense me. And this is gained only by being together and spending a long period of time. When I say long, it doesn't mean like several days, like a couple of hours, actually, it's enough to create a space of trust. And there is two things that is for me important to do, if we don't count speaking. It's eating together, and then staying until the moment that the person, if this person is a little bit aged, that this person falls asleep. And for me, this is like a beautiful moment of trust. It means that I can work and get to any intimate space of my character if he or she is trusting and falling asleep in front of my camera. But this also happened, for example, with this young lady that fell asleep. But of course, for her, it was more challenging. I guess she got tired, of being there and thinking of how she's in front of the camera. And I know that it was challenging. I can imagine, but there is a moment she got just tired to process it, and she had to let it go. It's also about letting it go. But also, thinking about the feminine part, I think that sleep, it's an incredible escape from the structured society, structured patriarchal society. I think that at least where we live in Central Asia, and this female space, it's yes, it is more chaotic. And maybe I speak about certain cosmogonies and the beliefs, or the spiritual spaces, let's say, they are not so structured, and there is no hierarchy, it's not hierarchical. The beliefs, they exist kind of on the same level. And I think that this is a very, for me at least, inspiring and interesting space to enter and to be part of, that also is accessed through dreaming, through yes, through sleeping, in fact, and through dreaming. And these are the spaces that are still considered to be irrational, you know, they are seen as irrational spaces, but I believe this irrationality can today provide probably other alternatives to think, and especially for the creative practices, you know, to develop our work.
Thank you so much. I see we have a couple of questions, and Sarah, you had your hand up. Do you want to, but it's gone down. I don't know if you want to ask a question.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you so much. I loved both these talks, and I always find these salons so invigorating. So thank you for continuing all this excellent work around sleep. My question was towards CRESSIDA, and I was wondering if you sort of mentioned a class that you were speaking about, and I just thought maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I taught a fourth-year seminar called The Politics of Sleep, which the trouble with all my work is it's very hard to put it into a discipline. So I'm a philosopher, but I work in a political science department. So I had to teach this as under a political science rubric. So it was called political theory, but really it was very interdisciplinary, and there were lots of things that were interesting about it. I mean, the best thing about it was we have really great students for many reasons here at U of A, but the enthusiasm that the students showed and the depth of their engagement with thinking and talking about sleep really surprised me. When I started teaching this, I think the first year I taught it was 2017, and I thought it was a bit eccentric, you know, that I didn't know if they would be interested in it. Maybe I was just older than them and tired, and I didn't know if that would be something they'd want to talk about. But the importance of sleep in their lives was really striking. Because they were overworked, so they really wanted to read radical literature about the politics of work, and they really wanted to think about rest and leisure as political issues. So that was one very interesting aspect of it. For me, the most valuable kind of pedagogical aspect of the course was that it involved a tremendous amount of lateral thinking and teaching. So let's talk about this thing, sleep. It's not really a thing, but this topic, this theme, sleep, and thereby try and approach all sorts of other questions. So it enabled me to teach across a very wide range of ideas, and but always approaching the idea through this singular theme. And I think for a lot of students, perhaps especially in the more conventional social science disciplines than in the humanities, where they're accustomed to being taught courses on, you know, the government of Canada or qualitative methods or something, that to have a course in which they were looking at interdisciplinary literatures where everything was approached in this lateral way was really interesting kind of learning experience. So yeah, I'm happy to send the syllabus to anybody who's interested, or any of the sort of, you know, the assignments, the materials that we used. It was really interesting. And at least one paper that I co-authored with a student came out of that seminar, and other students wanted to present and publish and discuss and bring their work into sort of other forums. So it was good in that way too.
Yeah, I'd love to see that syllabus. And in fact, if anyone is interested in maybe I'd written down at one point, workshop on the pedagogy of sleep. If anyone wants to put their name in
really
the chat
interesting.
to sign up for that workshop, let me know. I'm teaching a seminar next semester. So
yeah, I wanted to do sleeping in class, but that proved interestingly difficult, and I ended up not doing it. But that was something I wanted to explore, and we talked about why we didn't do it, why we didn't have a nap in the middle, kind of thing, you know. Yeah.
Great question. I suggest taking your students to see Christian Markley's The Clock at 2 a.m. Oh, that did it for me.
Okay.
Julia, I think you're up next.
Hello, I'm Julia. Thank you so much, Alanna, for the Sleep Salon. Brilliant. All of my research is empirical method, experimental psychology. So to come here and hear more of a breadth of sleep is just such a breath of fresh air for me. Thank you for CRESSIDA and Saodat for your talks, which I hugely enjoyed. Saodat, your work is beautiful and fascinating, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. I have a question, but it's not properly formulated in my head, so I'm sorry if it's a bit garbled. I'm intrigued by the commonality of themes that you found in the dreams. The one that struck out was the tiger that had gone extinct, and yet current people were dreaming about that. And I just wondered what your thoughts were around this. I'm not looking for an answer. I'm just curious what your thinking process is in terms of, is this a spiritual process? Is it a collective unconscious process? Is it the morning talking about dreams, storytelling, folklorish thing that's going on? Yeah, it's getting garbled, so I'm going to leave my question there. Thank you.
Well, I think that it can be all of it. It can be a spiritual space, you know, which makes total logic, because in our, you know, in Central Asia, even if we are Muslim, we still have a very strong presence of animalistic practices. So we have animals like connect different dimensions, like the snakes have certain responsibility, birds another, and the tiger, which I was not so much aware of, but then when I collected these dreams, I understood that actually my mother and my grandmother both were speaking about a presence of a tiger in a dream as a owner of the land, that we don't own it, but that it belongs, that there is another owner. And so then, of course, there is this spiritual space that you cannot deny. But, you know, these spaces are not researched, and they are not yet, they don't have a terminology, you know, they are not yet placed. And maybe this is good, you know, that they float and they are flexible. Then there is definitely a collective conscious memory, and maybe even an act of mourning for an animal that has extinct. And I think the fact that this was a sacred animal, because from other resources I found out that the animal was never hunted by locals, because if you would hunt or kill it, you will be cursed and punished, especially on the side of the fertility. So if you look at the history of the region, you know, the animal was sacredly worshipped. And then there is somebody that arrives, a stranger, that takes your land, that takes your religion, and that puts a new rules that you are not really aware of. And that's, again, a figure or a presence that opens a hunt on a sacred animal. Of course, it has an impact, even if it is not spoken, you know, even if it is not discussed, and even if it is not agreed, saying like this animal is sacred, and it became a kind of a sacrifice of a new regime. Somehow it gets this image, and it lays in the mind of people. And a beautiful part, you know, that they were telling me, they still believe that it is alive. They still believe that the animal is there, but when they speak about the presence, and when they were trying to explain me that it is alive, you understand that it is not, but it becomes even more bigger and mystified in their imagination. You know, like they say things that again are very inspiring for a filmmaker. They say there is a moment when the sound in the air stops. It means that the tiger is there, you know. And so just an image of a sound stopping, it's a very strong presence, I think. How air, how the sound can stop, you know. So if that's how they describe a tiger, it means that the tiger became, I don't know how it was the figure of a tiger before its extinction. Maybe it had another presence, you know, but now it became quite enormous. And when they speak about it, they speak about resistance. It also became a figure of a certain type of a resistance related to a culture, related to language, related to the land itself, you know. So it's, you know, I cannot say whether it's a spiritual or a collective conscious or an act of mourning. I think that it's a presence that goes, fills all those spaces.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Jean, I think you're next.
Hi, I hope it's okay if I have a comment and a question. Thank you for these amazing presentations. Saodat, I also found your work beautiful. I really hope I have a chance to see it exhibited soon. You know, I'm just struck that, you know, CRESSIDA suggested we can think of the image of sleep or sleepiness as, you know, not slowness and emptiness, but a kind of endurance. And I'm just struck that, Saodat, your work offers so many visual examples of how we might imagine it so, you know, from the tiger to the river, which I think is a very beautiful kind of figure for kind of continuity, survival, endurance, but also a great description of what it feels like to sleep. You know, sleeping is like being swept up in a river beyond our control. And it's also such a beautiful image for, I think, the way that you're thinking about sleep as a kind of, you know, a means of local knowledge and also a medium for cross-generational knowledge. This kind of, you know, mixing of generations is something that strikes me in your work, and the way that sleep becomes a way of linking to a past that is not accessible in, you know, the spaces of waking life. So yeah, that's just a kind of reaction to your work and not a question so much. CRESSIDA, it's really great to hear this new work presented. I've been reading Anaesthetics of Existence in my grad seminars in the last few years, including this quarter. And my students really love that book. It speaks to them in a very powerful way. I have a question for you about, you know, as you're thinking about sleep in connection to a kind of feminist politics of work, whether race enters your considerations. And I ask this because, you know, I think we see a lot of images of sleep being advertised, marketed, commodified these days. And very often it's the bodies of white women that we see in this kind of advertising imagery. That photo of Arianna Huffington, it's kind of familiar, just the pose, the trappings, you know, we see that type of image a lot. And, you know, I've been learning a lot from Black feminist approaches to sleep. And many, you know, many have pointed out that their projects that are thinking about sleep as part of a Black feminist politics begin from a kind of absence of images of well-rested Black people and Black women in contemporary culture. This is a point that has been made by Anna Tabor-Smith, who is part of an art collective called House Full of Black Women. I think Tricia Hershey, who is, you know, has a project called, I think the ministry, the Black Ministry of Sleep.
The NAP
Ministry.
The
NAP Ministry also mentions how hard it was to find images of well-rested Black women. And yeah, this is a kind of motif that comes up again and again. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I do. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's even worse than that, if you know, if I can say, but that in fact there is a visual history of racist images of sleep that represent Black women as idle, lazy, right? And similarly with representations of Indigenous people as lazy. I mean, the history of that going all the way back to Locke, right? So think of that kind of literature of people who are nomadic, or people who don't farm land, who don't engage in European agricultural practices, are not having a different relationship to land, but are lazy because of those lifestyles or cultures. So I think that, in fact, there are lots of ways that racism permeates images of sleeping people, mainly through a failure to understand overwork and depletion, exhaustion, through institutions like settler colonialism, like chattel slavery, of whole populations of people who were deprived of sleep and then represented as having failed in a European ideology of industry, right, in both senses of that term. So on the one hand, I talk about this in my seminar, and we do some readings and thinking about that. So that I think on the one hand, there's a kind of historical problem that people like Trish Hershey are responding to. And then on the other hand, of course, there's exactly what you described, that there's a paucity of positive images. So in some of the stuff I've done about work, I talk a little bit about that. I talk a little bit about Hershey's work, but I also have an analysis of a visual art project called Black Power Naps, which was a really great intervention. I don't know if you saw that. That was a part installation, part series of images of Black people sleeping and sleeping together. So it's also about the communality of sleep. That's in similar way to the nap ministry. It's a kind of, but an artistic, whereas I think Hershey is kind of spiritual, and she's using social media to make her point. But this is an artistic pushback against some of that racist history. So there's that work and lots of things like it that are trying to say, like the tagline of Black Power Naps is, what have you done to enable Black people to rest? And that I find is a very provocative and difficult question to ask to all sorts of different groups of people, right? Like it's a provocation to those of us who are white or otherwise implicated in racist systems that exploit the labor of BIPOC people. But it's also I find a controversial question to ask often to people who are exploited in those ways, right? Like, do you want us to stop, right? Do you want us to give up? Do you want us to lie down and sleep instead of making trouble for racism? And so I think that there are really provocative, but also quite difficult conversations to be had about the way that supporting rest gets represented as quietism, or a desire for people to stop being political about racism, or a genuine desire to change some material conditions that would provide rest to marginalized, racialized population, like all sorts of different kinds of modes of uptake. So yeah, I think that there's obviously a lot more to say about that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jean. And I'll just always plug Franny Noodleman's Fighting Sleep as a fantastic historical account of how rest also has a political activist dimension. Mm-hmm. I also just put a link to our Sleep Salon 6 on performing sleep, because you brought up Amara Tabor Smith and House Full of Black Women, and they gave an amazing talk about their project there. Alex.
Hello, thank you so much, Saodat and CRESSIDA, for your talks. I also feel invigorated and energized by both of them. My question is, kind of follows up on what Jean started, was asking, and I think might generate answers from both of you, but I think it starts with CRESSIDA first. And it's kind of a question about that, thinking about the ideas of productivity and gender that you work through in your presentation. And I was, as you were talking, I was starting to think about all the different ways that productivity can be measured in different ways, or can be thought of outside of this entrepreneurial
sort of idea of creativity, of light bulb moments and things like that, and more around the ideas of, for example, maintenance and care, and teaching, all the kind of work that also is associated with women, but is kind of a productivity outside of this, of a sort of industrialized or monetizable kind of productivity. So I was wondering whether, or how would such productivity, or how would such work intersect with your ideas around the energy around sleep? And then conversely, I was wondering whether, as Saodat, the more you were talking, the more I was struck by how much work women are doing in this dream interpretation. And we don't think of it as work, but it is a kind of teaching and care that women take on in a society to pass on this knowledge and information. And it's not just gestational time. It's not just reverie. It's not daydreaming. It is something that is sociable, and it is a helping others. It is a kind of maintenance of a culture and a collectivity. But we don't think of it necessarily as something that is entrepreneurial or productive in those ways, but it is also energy. So I'm not sure how sleep falls across all these things, but maybe you can help me out.
Saodat, did you want to speak to that?
Go ahead, CRESSIDA, because I think that I need to sing a little bit.
Me too.
I'm going to put it together.
Yeah.
Unless you want, I start, and I will think while I'm speaking.
I'll do that thing where you say things as your brain whirs behind the scenes.
It's okay. I mean, it's open-ended remark. It could just be a comment.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's a long-standing distinction, isn't it? I mean, it's in Arendt, it's in Beauvoir, right? All of these ideas that that the maintenance of life is labor and devalued and feminine, and then there's work, and which is masculine and valuable and productive, and somehow that maintenance is not important and doesn't count as work. And of course there's lots of obvious feminist reasons to resist those distinctions and that characterization, but I think that there have to be, it has to sort of go deeper in the sense that it has to involve rethinking temporality, so the lived experience of time, and trying to kind of reimagine the relationship between time and doing. I know that sounds like the kind of incredibly highly abstracted thing that only a philosopher could dream of saying, but it's that was what I started trying to articulate in Anaesthetics of Existence, was the way that we represent agency, for example, as this kind of fetishized concept. I feel like I can say that here, because if you say that in philosophy, people are like, oh, agency is very important, it's extremely valuable. But this sort of fetish concept that is represented only through doing, and sometimes only through form, like just, I mean, literally doing, not doing things that actually exhibit your agency in any robust sense, but just, that's why I, not without some hesitation, but use the word mania to describe this debate that Musk has sort of thrown himself into, and in some ways epitomizes that it's a sort of compulsive and obsessive desire to act and to be seen to be acting, as if that represents these qualities of agency and ultimately of personhood that are valuable. Whereas to prescind from acting, to do nothing, to sleep included, is somehow not to have any of these qualities of agency or sort of capacity to, it goes beyond agency. It's like capacity to be human and influence the world, right? To count as a subject almost. And so that the way that we gradually have diminished any sort of content to the value of doing, to where it's thrashing about and being seen to be doing so, is important to theorize, but it requires just a sort of very deep reconceptualization of of action and time as two basic concepts. You know, the better person who understands this much better than me is Lisa Baretza, who is a really great, you probably know her work, really great psychoanalytic thinker who has 2 books that are connected, one on maternal time, something interruptions, I can't remember the title, and then the more recent one, really excellent, is called Enduring Time. So when I talked about enduring, I was kind of referencing Lisa's work because I think that she's really canny about how to understand time in this context. So just read Lisa, if you haven't already.
Well,
you.
in fact, yeah, thank you. What I was thinking, it's you know, a question that rose right now for me. It's how do we transmit knowledge through a routine labor, you know, within the female spaces, because in Central Asia is still a house where, of course, everything happens, you know. It's a space of women, you know, home is a space of women. And there is this full basic routine of, let's say, preparing to sleep, eating before that, waking up, washing, cleaning, the labor that female is responsible. As you say, it's unvalued. Yes, unfortunately, it's still unvalued and seen as more like you have to do that, and it's not even spoken out, you know, this part of the labor, which is takes all female life, in fact. But how these very simple acts, very routine basic acts are taken care in a way that, or the stories build up around that there is a knowledge that goes together with that. And this is a question to me also, you know, because there is something related to touch, I believe, to probably smell, you know, and to this repetitive movement that you grow together with, where the transmission happens. It's not only about phrasing or verbalizing. But then another image that came, it's actually an embroidery, because in Uzbekistan we are very rich for the embroideries, and that these embroideries mostly are astral. So there is the kind of encode understanding of movement of the planets, of time, and that these embroideries normally are hanged in a space where you sleep, you know. So this is your company, but that put into a visual form and shape that also works as a protection and also as a blessing for the fertility and reproduction. So I believe there is a common space, and all these points come together. Yeah, but yeah, it's it's something, I guess, to think more and to explore. Yeah.
Thank you.
But
Maybe there are other terms too that we don't tend to use, like companions to our sleep, or something like that. Like it's not just, maybe it's not considered. Maybe there are things that shouldn't be considered work or labor, but that are more about taking care of the other or accompanying someone through something, that are maybe something else entirely. I don't know, just made me think of that.
But there is definitely also all these science related to food and sleep, you know, which is in Central Asia, is also very strong, you know, written by Avicenna, how our body reacts to certain plants and food in an act of sleeping, you know, which is also, I guess, is an interesting field to explore and understand. Yeah.
I see that we're almost out of time, but Annabelle has the last question for today.
I'm sorry, my camera is not working. So yeah, thank you both for your presentations. That was really great. I just have a quick question for CRESSIDA, because your your talk made me think about the Reclaim the Night movement as a feminist gesture. And I guess my question is kind of twofold. If you had any thoughts about that from your experience on this topic in community, and also if you had also considered the ideas around wakefulness as a feminist gesture at night. And I'm saying that in relation to conversations I've had or kind of research I've done, but with artists around feminist approaches to sleep and reclaiming the night in the sense of having time at night as a woman to do something you could not otherwise do. That might be because the kids are asleep or because of the expectations of hard work and etc. Are gone. So yeah, just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Thanks. There was one word in the question that I didn't hear. I understood that you were asking about feminist take back the night actions, and the idea that feminists that working at night and reclaiming rest is a feminist gesture. But there was one word. What was it that I missed?
Yeah, I was talking about wakefulness.
Wakefulness, I think that
so
was the word.
Yeah, instead of in the sense it's like instead of sleep and lying flat as a feminist gesture.
Yes.
Because of Reclaim the Night, I was thinking, yeah, if you have thought about other ways that might include, for example, wakefulness.
Yes.
As a feminist take on sleeping instead of conforming to the patterns of sleep, but also as a nighttime, as a specific time where women might feel more free.
Yeah, I think there are lots of ways of approaching that theme. That are really interesting. I mean, I've thought a little bit about Take Back the Night. There's a book coming out with Duke by Jonathan Goldberg-Hiller that's about the political and legal theory in the night, and he has a chapter in that book about Take Back the Night. And it's interesting to think about night as a category that has a politics and a history. And so I learned a lot from reading that manuscript. So I think, of course, that night is in all sorts of ways a time that is unsafe, not just for women, unmodified, but for lots of different groups and for lots of reasons. And so there's lots of good reasons to think that for women, being able to be safely out at night is an important gesture, but that cross-cuts in a way that I haven't really thought through yet, and I know I haven't, with the demand that people get rest and that they get rest in regular ways. So some of the reading that I've done on shift work and on women on sleep deprivation, particularly for new mothers, that part of the project that's about sleep coaching and having a baby and so on, really brings home the extraordinary effects of sleep deprivation and the lack of the really damaging consequences of not having a regular sleep cycle. And not that everybody has to sleep at night for 8 hours and then be wakeful during the day, but I think it would be a mistake to romanticize the way that people are routinely and structurally deprived of the opportunity to have that kind of sleep. And so there's, I think, some sort of cross-cutting demands of, on the one hand, wanting to be free at night in the sense of having safety at night, being able to claim public space, and on the other hand, this literature about how sleep deprivation impacts different populations. So I haven't written anything about that. So it's just an ongoing conversation.
Well, thank you everybody for a really brilliant discussion and a great conversation. Thank you so much to CRESSIDA and to Saodat for being here with us today. The end of the conversation really made me think of what I think of as a founding impulse for the Sociability of Sleep, which is Jasmine Pateja's Meet to Sleep, which takes place in December every year. So I'm just going to put a link to that in the chat. If you'd like to find out more about this project, which is a response to street and sexual harassment by collective resting in public spaces. I also just wanted to mention 2 upcoming events. We'll be announcing the winter sleep salons with really amazing guests, some of whom are here today, shortly. But in the meantime, we have 2 more events coming up with Sociability of Sleep in 2022. The first is on, well, no, it's not exactly our event. It's Eugene Lee's event, who is here with us as well, who has an exhibition in London called Eugene, I'm blanking the light weavers, but there's a first part.
And by the light weavers.
Thank you, which we'll put a link to in the chat as well. That we'll be spreading the word about through Sociability of Sleep. If you're in London, I encourage you to check out the exhibition and also workshops that Eugene is doing. CRESSIDA, you would love her work. She has a piece called We Like to Stay Horizontal. And then lastly, on December 10th in Montreal, if you were around, we are doing a collaborative intervention with the Yayoi Kusama exhibition at the Fondation Phi through Sociability of Sleep called How to Stay Sleepy, which I think, again, directly responds to these points that we've been exploring today about feminist alternatives to the culture of work. But also understanding what work these in-between states can produce in dialogue with Kusama's work and with the Do Soft Club in Montreal. So even if you can't get into that exhibit, and you can't because no one can get into the Kusama exhibit, you can come and participate in that workshop if you're around, and we'll be sharing that through the SOS website as well. So that's it. Thank you everybody for being here. Have a great day, and we'll see you in 2023.